Welcome to this latest edition of Neighbourhood Scop. Today we are going to be discussing Afghanistan. It hasn't been discussed for a fairly long period of time, and there are a lot of interesting developments which are happening inside Afghanistan and, of course, in the extended region of Afghanistan, not the least of which is the current crisis in the Middle East between Israel and Iran, and what the implications of that will be on Afghanistan and the rest of the region. We'll discuss that as well. But Afghanistan, in and of itself, is extremely critical for India and, of course, for the region. And I think it's important that we keep discussing what is happening in Afghanistan because while many other countries of the world will have the luxury of uh, turning their backs on Afghanistan, India is one country which cannot afford to do that. Afghanistan is in our neighborhood, and what happens in Afghanistan invariably has a fallout effect on India. So today we're going to discuss Afghanistan, and as usual, have a fabulous panel. We have Elizabeth Threlkeld, who's a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. We have Suleiman bin Shah, who is founder and CEO of Catalyst, a consulting firm based in Kabul. He's also served as a deputy minister of industry and commerce in the old regime, and he will be joining us from Kabul. We have Dr. Raghav Sharma, professor and director of the Center for Afghan Studies at the School of International Affairs at OP Jindal Global University. Raghav, if I might be permitted to say, is also the son-in-law of Afghanistan. So he's somebody with a personal stake in Afghanistan, has studied there, worked there, and knows the country better than many other Indians. And of course, we have Shivam Shekhawat, who's a junior fellow at ORF's Strategic Studies program and focuses on Afghanistan and rest of India's neighborhood. Without much ado, let me just start the ball rolling with Suleiman Shah. Suleiman, since you are in Kabul, uh, please give us some idea of how things are where you are right now, because we read a lot about it in different media organizations, a lot of analysis from people who are not in Afghanistan. So we would like to get some kind of a feel of what life is like in Kabul, how it has changed over the years, um, what are the dangers, what are the good things which are happening. If you can just give us a bird's eye view of how things are in Kabul. Suleiman.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the foundation for organizing this and giving me an opportunity. Thanks also to Aditya and Shivam for facilitating my participation. And I'm very happy, very pleased to be at least talking to Indian colleagues or participating in a program that is organized in India after a very long time. My last visit to India was some 10 years ago, and I have really found memories of staying in Delhi and Mumbai. I think it's a very important question, but also not an easy one to answer. I'll try to be as simple as possible. Things in Afghanistan are a mixed reality, if may I say. If you look at the 2021 transition that has happened in Afghanistan, there are certainly a few things that are very new to all of us, to all the 40 million people living in Afghanistan. And that is the discontinuation of the war. That was a bloody war for 20 years that has brought a tremendous amount of suffering to the Afghan communities across the country. So the discontinuation of war, I was part of the cabinet in the previous regime, and we used to receive, reports that would quote hundreds and hundreds of Afghans fighting on both sides, killed every day. So that has stopped. The raids have stopped. The occupation that was there for 20 years. Of course, the NATO forces and the U.S. forces. also committed, along with others, different kinds of stuff, including the nitrates. So people are very happy that those nitrates are gone. Mothers, sisters, daughters, wives, they don't receive news of killings. There is a freedom of movement. You can travel from south to north, east to west without any problem anymore. And that has also given a huge sort of relief to our private sector, to our businesses. By the way, that also includes women who are actively pursuing their entrepreneurial goals in Afghanistan. So the discontinuation of war and in having somewhat, some form of peace in Afghanistan is a very new thing to experience, frankly speaking. I've not left in 2021 and I decided to stay in my country. And I think in the last 4 years, I've seen sort of all the outcomes that positive peace brings, that stability brings. And I think this has been unprecedented, at least in the last 4 decades of Afghanistan. Now, on the other hand, of course, we also have issues and problems, but I think we used to have issues and problems before 2021 as well. And that, of course, mostly relates to the political side of Afghanistan, the non-recognition of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan ruling around the country, social restrictions that are always talked about, for example, a ban on secondary schools and some institutions. Rights is another issue that always talked about, but I think there are different perspectives to see that. So what I'm trying to say is that we still have a long way to go when it comes to our social, economic, and development goals in Afghanistan and making this country a better place to live, particularly in the very complex neighborhood that we live in. But at the same time, of course, there are challenges and there are things that very important, not for Afghans, but also for the region and people of the region. Please, shoot me a question. I'm trying to be brief here, but just to give you, sort of a bird eye view of what's happening.
Suleiman, if I just can ask you a follow up. Personally, for someone like you who served in the previous regime, to have decided to stay back in Kabul, uh, how much did it affect you at a personal level and other people like you? Because again, there have been a lot of stories of reprisal attacks, of revenge attacks, all kinds of other things happening to people associated with the previous regime. So just wanted to get an idea of how life is, one, for people who were part and parcel of the previous regime, and and linked with that, this entire thing about, there was a whole lot of young people, there was a certain vibrancy which we saw in Kabul before the Taliban takeover. uh, is it now the piece of the graveyard, or is an exaggeration?
I think that would not be a fair statement. I think the vibrancy that you're talking about is coming back to the streets of Kabul and major other urban centers. But please allow me to say that for decades, Afghanistan's rural and urban areas have been very differently populated by design, by default, many other considerations. And you can see that whether it was before 2021 or after 21, life in rural Afghanistan has not changed much. It has not changed for its inhabitants. I think we can definitely see some streaks of change when it comes to urban centers, but the vibrancy that you're talking about is coming back to the streets is because of the stability that people are experiencing. I think the trauma, the collective trauma that Afghans and Afghanistan has, will require time to heal the wounds of the past and, be back into a normal life. Now, to your question, whether I, experienced any difficulties, oh, yes, like any other Afghans, we have experienced difficulties with the transition of the government, but particularly because how the engagement with Afghanistan suddenly shifted overnight. I think the political transition that you saw in Afghanistan was also in many ways, deeply personal for Afghans. We thought the 20 years of allies are going to stay, but it didn't happen as expected. And I think people took it very deeply on their personal lives. And so in the aftermath of 2021 or August 2021, you saw that immediately many Western countries and big organizations that were actively involved and engaged and were investing in Afghanistan suddenly pulled out. And I think it brought economic disasters for the communities in Afghanistan. We're still not connected to the global financial system. We don't have access to a lot of markets or students, businessmen, women, elderly, sick people. Let's say they don't get visas, they cannot travel for their legitimate purposes, not intending, of course, to stay in that third country, but just for the things that we used to travel. So that all was gone, and I think it had a tremendous effect on how life was in the first and second year after the transition. And I think I also experienced those difficulties, but on a personal level, no, I have not received any harm. In fact, I was offered to join the government at various positions, but I've declined, and I'm still continuing to work with communities in Afghanistan, with different international organizations, with the women-led businesses, mostly private sector. So for me, yes, it was a crisis moment. But I think Afghanistan, and particularly in my personal experience, has been experiencing crises, at least for the last 15 years, decades, or presidential elections in 2014, the withdrawal of NATO forces, coming down all to the second election that we had in 2017 was a crisis. We had COVID, droughts, climate. So there are multiple challenges, were there, are there, and I mean, they will be there in future as well. And we have to look at the life in Afghanistan from sort of that angle that, just like in other country, we have issues, we have some great things happening, but at the same time, we continue to suffer due to, the policies of the government, but also because of the policies of the region and international community.
Professor Sharma, if I can turn to you now. We've heard what Suleiman had to say, but we also know that there are reports of a socio-political tussle which is taking place. Within the Taliban system, there are pulls and pressures which are quite visible. We also know that within the Afghan society, and since you are linked to it in one form or another, within the Afghan society, there are aspirations of the young, which probably are conflicting with how the Taliban look at many of the new developments taking place. Uh, how do you make sense of these various multiple tussles which are underway in Afghanistan?
Thanks, Sushant. And I think it's good that ORF has initiated a discussion.
Allow me. The reason I was asking this question is also because I'm linking up these tussles between what we see is a kind of a very pragmatic approach that Afghanistan seems to have when it's dealing with the rest of the world. They have a certain dogmatism when somebody is making prescriptions on them on what they should do internally, but they're very dogmatic internally. So there is that, it's a kind of a dichotomy of extreme pragmatism, not extreme, but pragmatism dealing with foreign countries, but dogmatism while dealing with local communities. How is that going to be playing out now?
Yeah. So I think it's good, first of all, that you're having this discussion on Afghanistan, because that's a country that's petered out from public memory to a large extent over the last couple of years. I think I'd agree with what Suleiman said, that Afghanistan, over the last 4 odd decades of conflict, it's a very checkered experience. You can't talk of a uniform experience of the last 20 years of American intervention. You can't also talk of a uniform experience in the context of Taliban rule. The experience is very different depending on which side of the political line you are. In terms of the push and pull, the aspirations, the dogmatism versus, the transactionalism, yes, the Taliban has been very transactional in its engagement with the rest of the world. And the world has been very transactional in terms of its engagement with the Taliban. In fact, this is a striking contrast between the Taliban 1.0 and 2.0. I mean, data available, I think, up till 2023 or early 24, the Taliban claim to have had more than or close to 1,400 diplomatic engagements, with the majority of them taking place in Kabul, with China leading the pack. Pakistan being a distant fifth, so that gives you a sense in terms of how the ground has shifted geopolitically. And this is in stark contrast to the Taliban of the 90s, where they were isolated. Pakistan was their lifeline, so to speak. So yes, there is a lot of transactionalism on both sides, and that, I think, stems from the necessity that the Taliban do sort of realize the fact that they have to engage the world, although they want to do so on their own terms, because they feel they've vanquished a major military alliance, after fighting them 20 years on the battlefield. So they want to do so without being preached to. And they know that for their longevity, for their sustainability, that engagement is a necessity. But domestically, they have been more dogmatic. But again, this is not a black and white scene on the domestic front either. Yes, what we've seen is curriculum has undergone a change under the Taliban. We've seen a proliferation in the number of madrasas under the Taliban. People I've talked to are concerned about the kind of education that boys are getting. Many friends, family members I've talked to are very concerned about that. And they do feel that this dogmatism, and my impression is that this dogmatism also stems from the fact that the Taliban have to also it is an ideological movement which is still struggling to make a full-time transition to governance. They have a domestic constituency which they ought to cater to within Afghanistan. So I don't see them making that, a radical jump on the domestic front, because it will be hard for them to justify that to their domestic constituency. But at the same time, at the local level, there's also been a lot of negotiation. So we hear a lot about, the ban on work for women, the ban on education for women. While that is true, but at a local level, there've been, instances where the Taliban actually have allowed women to continue working for the UN. They have allowed women to work. In fact, there's an Indian I know in Kabul who's based there for the last 20 years. He runs a media company and he employs women and he travels with them across the country. So there are ways that Afghans have found to negotiate, this very checkered landscape. Similarly, we read a lot about the secret schools. And one of my friends, who I won't name, he was a colleague of mine. He works for an NGO and he has cousins in the GDI. And they run a program where they actually supply tablets to girls and they run online education programs. And I asked him, how do you manage to do that? He said, well, there are people in the GDI who know that we run these programs, but they just choose to look the other way, because they don't necessarily agree with what the movement is doing. But they, at the same time, are not going to come out and express their dissent publicly. Also, it's important to keep in mind, I think something that Suleiman hinted to in his opening remarks, a lot of what the Taliban are playing out in rural areas, it's not a radical disjuncture. And that is because a lot of areas in Afghanistan had a dual form of governance. The Afghan government was funding schools. The Taliban were actually running them in line with what they believed conformed with their cultural standards. And what we've seen, in fact, latest data from the World Bank shows is, while the Taliban have outlawed women from attending secondary school, there's an uptick in girls' enrollment up to the primary level. It's at an all-time high, and that is largely because of two factors. One, conflict has ebbed, so schools have become more accessible. And in many areas, people feel that, even conservatives feel that schools are more aligned with their cultural value standards. So it's not a uniform experience. It's very checkered.
Just as a follow-up, Raghav, when you say that it's very checkered, are we looking at regional variations in the sense that from what we learn, the south of Afghanistan is extremely orthodox, very, very conservative, and perhaps the experiences out there would be very different from maybe the north, and maybe depending on who is in power within the Taliban movement, which faction is in power in which part, because there is a certain amount of pragmatism that we are seeing from, for example, the Haqqani network or the erstwhile Haqqani network. They have a slightly different approach. The guys from Kandahar have a very different approach. So, are we seeing some of those variations also play out at local levels when you talk about, there is the experiences are different in different parts?
Yes, there are variations at the local level. I think a lot depends on who is the person you're dealing with in power. But I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say that, what the Kandahar faction represents is also representative of the society necessarily in Kandahar. Because from my own personal experience of having traveled across the country, what surprised me initially was that while, regions like Kandahar are considered to be supremely conservative, I actually encountered more what we'd label as radicalism today in the north, in provinces like Badakhshan, in districts like Rag, Argo, Faizabad. I encountered, attempts at proselytization, a lot more of radical posturing than I did in places like Kandahar. And I think a lot of this, I was told, had to do with the fact that there were 2 or 3 factors. One, Kandahar, regions like Kandahar, like Ghazni, they've had a long history of engaging with the subcontinent. They've had a long history of coexisting with people from other religious communities, minorities in particular. So all the kapra trade, all the money lending was done by religious minorities. So they've found a way to negotiate with, cultural differences, religious differences. In the north, what we've seen is a greater integration of northern provinces into the madrasa networks of Pakistan, right? And there's actually some excellent work that's been done on how the Taliban footprint expanded in the north, and the madrasa networks, one very important cog in the wheel, with a lot of mullahs trained in Pakistan in the north actually batting for the Taliban as they sought to assiduously work to expand their footprint. So I'm not sure if the factionalism and the policies of the different factions within the Taliban necessarily mirror the society, because personally my experiences have been different. But yes, who is in power, who are you dealing with at the local level, certainly makes a lot of difference. So there's a lot of negotiation at the local level, which actually doesn't, get really covered.
Elizabeth, if I can turn to you, if you could just switch on your, hi. So you've heard what Suleiman and Professor Sharma have said, and what we've heard so far is that we know how the Taliban are trying to engage with the world, at what terms. But since you are in Washington, I want to know what are the terms at which the world is ready to engage with the Taliban, because that is something what we are now starting to see is that it seems that the Taliban seem to be gaining greater acceptability around the world. People are no longer embarrassed or hesitant to be reaching out to the Taliban, engaging with them at some diplomatic level, having negotiations with them, trying to do some business with them. Do you think the world has learned to accept them, made their peace with the Taliban, and is ready to give them time, to change? After all, we've seen a lot of changes taking place in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia in the past was not very different from what the Taliban are talking about. So, if we were able to do business with Saudi Arabia in the past, what's the problem doing business with the Taliban today?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, for convening this conversation. I wish I were there in Delhi in person, but second best is getting to beam in. So, hi to many friends around the table at ORF and to fellow panelists. I think it's a really interesting time to be having this conversation. I will say, sitting in Washington, it is still early days of the Trump administration, and I think we are trying to get a sense of where policy is headed from Washington. I'll kind of focus on the U.S. view of this for now to the extent that I can, and maybe we can expand a bit later in the conversation. I should also say, with apologies, that I'm going to have to drop off in about half an hour. Kiddo's getting ready for school on this end, so I'm wearing two hats this morning. But from the U.S. perspective, I think we've seen a focus so far from the Trump administration on the detainee issue. We've seen 4 U.S. citizens who have been released through negotiated deals since January. To your point on kind of more willingness to engage, one of those detainee releases came after a visit by Adam Bowler, the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, and Zalmay Khalilzad, of course, the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan and negotiator of the 2020 Doha deal, made an unannounced visit to Kabul, which, by my count at least, was the first known visit of U.S. officials that we've seen to Afghanistan since 2021. Of course, there have been rumors of things that have happened on the intel side, but for an open visit to happen and then to translate pretty directly into release of a U.S. hostage, with that we saw the dropping of the $10 million reward for information on Sirajuddin Haqqani. So it seems like there was a bit of a quid pro quo there. And the U.S. subsequently then removed the Taliban from its 2025 U.S. threat assessment. So, I think we've seen through those instances that in very specific terms, when there is a clear transaction to be had, a deal to be made, this administration is willing to engage. Also on counterterrorism, right? ISK is a shared threat between the two sides, and even just in recent testimony that we've seen from military officials on the Hill, that has come out. We saw a focus in this from what would have been the State of the Union, the President Trump's speech to both houses of Congress earlier this year, where he focused on Pakistan, but Pakistan having delivered whom he identified as one of the orchestrators of the Abbey Gate attack, right? So I think in these instances, we can see areas of aligned interest between the US and the Taliban. The other way that this has come up is, and I know there's been kind of some speculation around this, for example, the Bagram issue, the weapons that were left behind from the US. I haven't seen any real concrete signs that there is movement on that. I think that is complicated for a host of issues, and putting my analyst hat on, don't think we are likely to see much other than stray comments there, though it's always difficult to predict the future, and particularly in an administration like this one, where, truly, I think what we have seen out of the Trump administration, not just in this case, but elsewhere, is a willingness to depart from foreign policy orthodoxy, right? And so maybe getting back to your example of Saudi Arabia, we are less likely to see a focus on human rights issues, issues of women, those sorts of things that were defining features of the Biden administration's foreign policy on Afghanistan. What Saudi Arabia had that I think the case is less clear on for Afghanistan is something to bring to the table, right? Saudi Arabia is a key source of oil, and that has in many ways incentivized that relationship. We hear about critical minerals from Afghanistan, but that is a really, really difficult prospect in some ways. You even look at China's engagement, and to my read, at least, it's been quite tentative, and there's been a lot of headlines, but when you look at what's actually happening, things haven't moved very quickly. So while that, I'm sure, will be something that will come up in conversations, we are quite a ways away from actually being able to explore that, in my view. Never mind the fact that Afghanistan remains a landlocked country. And any time that we would think about engaging in critical minerals, or even Bagram, to see a potential trade for those U.S. weapon systems that were left behind, you have to think about the air corridor that's attached to that. And that would likely bring us back into a similar position where we would need to have a conversation with Pakistan in terms of gaining access to Afghanistan for that air corridor or even ground lines of communication. So many of the same complicating factors that drove the really difficult choices the US made during the war effort in Afghanistan, I think, are still a feature of this relationship. The last thing I'll say here, just in initial comments, is, of course, the immigration piece of this is critical. And as we've seen elsewhere in the Trump administration's policy so far, it really is that domestic agenda that is driving foreign policy in some ways that feel novel. So removing temporary protective status for Afghans who are resident in the US is a really significant move that is due to terminate on July 14th. So I think we're likely to see a greater focus on Afghanistan and its situation in the run up to that, right? There's going to be some press reporting and I could imagine some criticism from Democrats. On the other side of the ledger, Afghanistan has been included in the travel ban, though I will say I was pleased to see there was still an exemption for the special immigrant visa applicants who are still around the region, whose cases are working through the system. So at least that still exists under this administration. The other piece of this, though, is looking at, we talked about the Trump administration, we talk about Washington, it's an easy throwaway, but as in any administration, there are differences of opinion depending on officials. And I think we were all kind of expecting a harder line on the Taliban when Mike Waltz was national security advisor. He's since shifted. And so perhaps that has created some space here. At the end of May, Secretary Hegseth has ordered a comprehensive review of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I imagine that will focus more on kind of Biden administration policies, though with some press attention coming to it. And then likely we saw Secretary of State Rubio say the U.S. is reviewing the Taliban's designation as a foreign terrorist organization. So again, with this, like some focus, some attention to the issue. It's not that the U.S. is turning the other way entirely, but to your earlier point, there is so much going on in the world, so little bandwidth, that I think expectations in terms of just the amount of attention and focus the U.S. is going to be able and willing to devote to Afghanistan should be pretty low. I'll leave it there for now.
You know, we've seen the US embrace Ahmad Shara in Syria, and it's not as though he was a less dubious character. In fact, in some ways, even more, because he was a member of the Al Qaeda in one form or another. But it seems that there is now a kind of an acceptability for these kind of people grabbing power. And I just wanted to get an idea whether that is exactly the case, or does it differ from case to case kind of a deal? You know, it depending on if you discover rare earth mineral deposits in Afghanistan, then they become acceptable. And if you don't, you can continue to ignore them. Is it purely about that level of transactionalism, or is there something else which could be at play on how you decide to deal with countries or regimes like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think here we have to go back to the President Trump's first term, right? In many ways, the deal that he struck in Doha with the Taliban was that moment. It's not today kind of in this post-takeover environment. It really was coming to the table and publicly sitting down and signing a deal with the Taliban. That was the break from orthodoxy, albeit one that had gained momentum over the past, really at that point, 5 to 8 years, I would say. So coming to today, I do think, as I was saying, this is an administration that is willing to cut deals and has, when immediate U.S. interests, as the Trump administration defines them, are at stake. And so hence the focus on releasing U.S. detainees. That's something that we have seen throughout. Bigger picture, I think there is this question of value proposition, right? What is in it for the US? That seems to be kind of the defining feature of the Trump administration's foreign policy, as opposed to kind of preservation of an idea of the liberal international order, right? We're not hearing that sort of rhetoric out of Washington today. The other piece of, though, is domestic politics and the baggage the U.S. carries from its 20 years in Afghanistan. We don't have a similar set of baggage when it comes to a place like Syria. And so I think the calculations around Afghanistan are always going to be a little bit more weighted with that. But again, coming to kind of the review the Pentagon is embarking on, much of that is inflected with the U.S. domestic policy space. And so even as we talk about Afghanistan, when we're looking to the past and looking to review that withdrawal decision, I would, for example, read that more as a domestic political move rather than something that is foreign policy related. So, it is quite difficult to project exactly where this administration is headed in Afghanistan, other than to say, if there is a deal to be made, I certainly wouldn't rule out a willingness to kind of tear up the playbook and explore those possibilities.
We did not have any relationship with the Taliban. Then we've developed a relationship, and that relationship has only grown over the last 4.5 years, or 4 years, or thereabouts. But given the kind of developments in the region, are we in a danger of losing Afghanistan? And I mean in terms of our access to Afghanistan. So, for example, the Pakistan route is, of course, close to us virtually. We used to go through Iran, but we know now what is happening in Iran. And there is a huge amount of churn taking place out there. And frankly, given the kind of positions we are being forced to take insofar as Iran is concerned, I would imagine that some of the stuff we were able to do in Afghanistan using the Iranian route probably shuts down for us. How do we manage our relationship with Afghanistan under the current circumstances?
I think if we start off with how India's engagement with Afghanistan has shaped in the last 4 years, obviously all of us here understand that while when the fall of Kabul happened in 2021, India did not, as opposed to some other countries in the neighborhood, did not like rush in terms of like engaging with the group. But now we see a more public and a more tacit acknowledgement of the Taliban being there in power in Afghanistan. And this, I think, the biggest manifestation of this was the recent call between India's external affairs minister and the Taliban's interim foreign minister. So obviously, with what is happening regionally between Iran and Israel and the kind of complexities that it will now bring in for the region, obviously it does raise some concerns for India. But I think I would now like to focus on how the Taliban itself is kind of viewing its relationship with both these countries. So for example, when the recent strikes happened, when Israel striked Iran, there was a strong statement from the Islamic Emirate spokesperson. They condemned the strikes. They obviously, the response was relatively harsher if you compare it to the kind of statement that they put in when India and Pakistan were engaged in a conflict in May. But they condemned the strikes. They condemned Israel's violation of Iran's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and they called on the international community to kind of, help make this stop. And this positioning, this did not just come in, like since the beginning of this phase of conflict between Israel and the Palestine and Gaza since October 2023, there have been consistent statements of support from Afghanistan. Last year also, when Iran struck Israel, Afghanistan did acknowledge it as Iran's right to self-defense, and they did say that, it was Israel, like they did blame Israel for the attack. So these statements of support and have been there, and they will still still be there. But in terms of there being like a tangible change in Afghanistan's policy or engagement with Iran, or in this conflict, that has not been there. So what I mean to say is, like, while they would be while the leadership would be putting out strong political statements opposing what Israel is doing in Iran, there has been some sort of reluctance from the political leadership of Afghanistan to do something tactical or something like material in this conflict. So, like, when the Gaza war began, there were reports about how Afghanistan would send in fighters to support in the war, but nothing of that materialized. There has been, obviously, but there is still a distinction between how the leadership is viewing it and how individual Taliban fighters might have a different perspective, because there comes in an element of like a faith-based sympathy, and it also feeds into their ideological support that they share with the Palestinian cause. So obviously that aspect still remains, and that could be a cause of concern for all the countries in the region, because the Taliban is also still in its transition phase from like a militancy and insurgency to finally like a fully established.
Sorry for interrupting, but I also heard some remarks from, again, this is on social media, so I don't know how much one needs to trust this, but there were some remarks from Taliban officials who also said that while they were condemning Israel's attack on Iran, they also said we have really no beef with Israel. So that kind of, this is the first time I've heard a regime as hardline as the Taliban come out and say we really have no beef with Israel. And I found that strange, unless I've heard something which is utterly bizarre and it was somebody shooting his mouth off. Where is that coming from?
I think, while I can't directly comment on the statement because I haven't exactly seen it, but I think it does fall into like this. So what Dr. Sharma also mentioned, like the pragmatism in their foreign policy approach and the dogmatism that they're practicing internally within the country. I think for the Taliban, if we consistently, like, they have had a number of diplomatic engagements with a lot of countries in the world, but if we focus on the kind of wordings that they choose to describe themselves or describe their approach towards the world, the consistent focus is on their economy oriented foreign policy, on their balancing foreign policy, on the fact that even though they have political differences with certain countries, they are still not they will still be able to work, they will still be willing to work with them if they can get some mutual benefits out of it. And that is what they've been doing throughout the region. So I think even if a statement like this would have come about, I think that comes on from this constant effort from their side to project this image of a power, which obviously they want legitimacy, they want to be acknowledged as like a regional power which can be beneficial for all the countries of the region. So I think it comes from their own process of redefining themselves, of repositioning themselves in the region, and of trying to kind of, sell out their Afghanistan as kind of like a viable partner for other countries to kind of secure their own interests. So I think, and that is what they've been doing. I see that whether it's engaging with India, whether it's engaging with Pakistan or China, you see this consistent focus on how they are a balanced power, on how they don't want conflict in the region, or on how their emphasis is on kind of ensuring that there's regional stability, that that there is not another crisis in the region. So the same kind of wording is in the current like Iran-Israel situation, the same kind of wording they used when India and Pakistan were when there was a conflict between India and Pakistan in May. I mean, they kept on, while India the Indian representative of the PAI division, he did meet the Taliban foreign minister immediately after the attack in April. The Taliban was also in consistent touch with their counterparts in Pakistan. And yes, there have been a significant downturn in the relationships, but the two sides have started engaging again, and China is also a part of that engagement. So I think in that respect, the Taliban's consistent effort over the last 4 years is to just position themselves as a responsible power, and just reiterate the fact that they would even for the Gaza war. I remember last year when the strikes happened, or when Israel when Iran struck Israel, the Taliban's interim minister did reiterate that while we have sympathy for the Palestinian cause, we would not be interfering in other countries' internal affairs. So for the Taliban, I think right now what they actually need is, they're still in transition phase. They're still trying to, stabilize the country as is. Their focus is on getting as many economic and material benefits as they could get from other countries. So for them, it's easier to keep their political messaging very strong, but then be very pragmatic in terms of how they're dealing with other countries. So I think it stems from that. On the question of whether the impact that it could have on India's outreach to Afghanistan, as I said, I don't see that with the recent situation. Obviously, the regional situation does become a bit more volatile, but I don't see anything tangibly changing from the Taliban side per se. India, Iran, and Afghanistan last year also they signed the agreement on Chabahar, and Taliban has also time and again stressed on the fact that they don't want the trade routes to kind of come in the middle of conflicts between the countries. And how even when the Pakistan-India conflict happened, and the closure of the Atari-Wagah border happened, Taliban, the Emirate did make this point to the Indian counterparts that they, their trade is being affected by that. And I think India did give some special access to some specific Afghan trucks to cross the border. So obviously, these concerns are important for Afghanistan, and I don't think that they would, in terms of India's economic engagement, I don't think any significant change I see from their side. But yes, if the situation in itself destabilizes, in terms of it's up to us to now see how the situation in Iran, turns out in the coming weeks. If there is a significant escalation, then obviously that there would be in terms of there being a tangible progress, there would be some issues. But I don't see in terms of their commitment to managing, establishing good relations with both India and Iran, that I don't see as changing with what's happening.
I don't think the problem is going to be commitment. I think the problem is going to be of access. But Elizabeth, I know that you have to go in about 10 minutes. So let me turn to you before I go back to the others. I wish we could have had you for longer, but I understand your own issues. So let me ask you a somewhat long-winded question, and you can take your time. So look, we know that the current US administration is transactional. Okay, that's a no-brainer. Everybody knows it, right? Now, we don't know whether the Bagram Air Base is going to be made available, not available. I have my own doubts. I don't see how the Taliban can ever sell that to their own people, given the kind of positioning they've taken. The mineral thing has been done to death since the 70s. I don't know if there are any minerals there or not, so I'm not getting into that. But I would imagine, can transactionalism be about terrorism? In the sense that, we've seen the ISK, we've seen that the Taliban are deadly opposed to the ISK, and we've also seen, and that's been the Indian experience, that the Taliban have ensured that Afghanistan does not become a base for anti-India terror groups to operate out of. And I think that is one of the driving factors that has pushed India and Afghanistan closer. But that's not how we are seeing the Taliban when it comes to Pakistan. So do you think terrorism, this is a question in two parts. First, on the transactionalism of terrorism, how do you see the US and the rest of the West relationship with Taliban on this one metric? And the second, as an American scholar, how do you look at what the Chinese have tried to do, intercede between Pakistan and Afghanistan and try to bring about some kind of a rapprochement between them? From your perch in Washington, how do you view these two developments?
Sure. I'll take on both of them in order. So, transactionalism on terrorism. I think there is a possibility there, though somewhat limited to an extent, right? And I suppose this will depend on how the terror threat landscape evolves in Afghanistan. There are aligned interests, and we have heard, positive signs coming out of quietly both the Biden administration, but also the Trump administration in terms of that CT cooperation. So I think that is very much on the table. I think that is where we are, though we don't talk about it very much. The question, though, for me is what actually happens on the CT front in Afghanistan? How successful are the Taliban in containing the threat from ISK? Certainly, God forbid, if we are to see another significant attack, then that would potentially drum up more interest and more potential there. The administration is pulled in so many different directions, and not just the US, but the wider world with all of the ongoing crises. And so while I think to the Trump administration's credit, they have maintained a focus on counterterrorism efforts in particular hotspots, it's not driving the conversation in Washington today. And perhaps that's a good thing, right? We don't need Afghanistan to be in the headlines. We don't need Afghanistan to be the source of a lot of kind of the playing out of domestic political fights in foreign policy. And so I am actually more comfortable with quiet, tacit cooperation on ISK. I just think there's by necessity kind of a ceiling there for what's doable based on Taliban capabilities, based on the US ability to collect and share intelligence. We can see that evolve, but I don't think that is really going to be the ticket that will be so transformative of the relationship unless there is something that would necessitate more of an intense focus on CT. I will say, as I referenced, recent testimony tells us that these are still live, real conversations. But I think that's still going to remain kind of in the quieter levels of the relationship between the two sides. On the question of China's role and particularly kind of the China, Afghanistan, Pakistan recent discussions, it's interesting. Certainly the fact that after those trilateral talks, we saw the Pakistani Chargé in Kabul upgraded to an ambassador. Like that's not nothing. And it speaks to a level of influence that China does have with the Taliban and indeed with Pakistan. But you also look at the challenges that China continues to face in Pakistan with their own counterterrorism efforts, right? The targeting of Chinese personnel and CPEC targets, and more broadly, the instability in KP and Balochistan. And there I would read China's leverage as far more limited in terms of what they've been able to do vis-a-vis Pakistan, vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And I think there's rightly a reluctance in Beijing to carry too much water for either side, maybe a recognition of how difficult that can be to be in that middle ground position, right? When Pakistan comes to Beijing and says, will you put pressure on the Taliban to contain the TTP? It's kind of a polite nod, but Beijing also tells Pakistan to make that request directly to Kabul. And so I think that geometry is certainly complex and evolving. We've heard for years about the extension of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor to Afghanistan. I think we will continue to hear language along those lines. I am not particularly holding my breath, but fundamentally what's different about the relationship now is that China doesn't need to go through Pakistan for this. I think China recognizes the interests for global or for regional stability in having less adversarial relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and is trying to do its part there. But really, when you look at bilaterally what's happening between China and Afghanistan, to my mind, that kind of tells us what we need to know. Yes, there's a lot of meetings. Yes, there has been kind of something approaching political recognition given, though certainly China will say it's not full recognition. But that's on the political side, and that's a relatively less costly endeavor than actual investments, long-term projects. So, we'll see what happens with the mining efforts that are getting started. But almost 4 years in, this is not the scenario that some kind of China hawks warned of in the US post-Taliban takeover, when it was, the US has ceded this ground in Afghanistan and China is going to swoop in and take advantage of the US investments over the last 20 years. Like that, to my mind, at least, is not the situation where we find ourselves today. And I think that's, again, a good thing, right? Like Afghanistan has not, at least so far, emerged as this kind of landscape for great power competition in a way that I think some feared that it would. And so that leaves some space for both the US to be involved, for China to be involved. It's not as contested a territory as I think I and some others feared that it might become in the emerging worldview, where that seems to be kind of the defining policy. Though I will say, before I wrap up here, we're still waiting to see what the Trump administration's China policy is, right? Like that, something so fundamental as how Washington and Beijing are approaching each other. It's been very trade-based. We've seen kind of on again, off again, and tariffs certainly, but just to kind of emphasize the level of flux and of uncertainty that's playing out more broadly in the policy landscape. And so it might be that as those policies become more defined, as we see the outcome of Iran-Israel, for example, some of the more kind of second and third order foreign policy challenges this administration face could come into a bit sharper relief. So all that is to say, I think, to be continued. And with apologies, I'm going to duck out. But thank you so much again for a great conversation, and hopefully look forward to getting back together in a few months' time when we have a little bit more to go on.
Know that you have to rush, but just one comment on what you said. I think it's fair to say that not just Washington, I think countries around the world have been taken by surprise of how things have actually developed in Afghanistan over the last 4 years. I think all the dire predictions that were being made before the Taliban takeover, I think they need to be watered down. And quite clearly, a lot of developments have happened which have surprised many people, including many people in India. So thanks a lot for being part of this. And I know that you have to rush, so we'll let you go and we'll just carry on the discussion with the other panel. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, as always.
Suleiman, if I can now turn to you again. You are a consultant out there. You have dealt with trade issues. Help us understand how an economy in Afghanistan is surviving, given that much of the foreign assistance has kind of dried up, what was coming earlier. A lot of the trade links that had been established are very jittery. You were yourself mentioning that, you cut off from the international financial systems. So how do transactions then take place? How do people survive? What happens to professionals? If the economy is not working the way it was in the past, there was a certain professional class which had come up. How does that professional class survive? Has it completely changed into different professions or gone into different lines of activity? Basically, I want to understand how businesses are operating, how people are managing their affairs. Of course, I know the rural areas have probably not seen much change. But I'm talking about the big urban centers. I'm talking about Kabul, I'm talking about Herat, I'm talking about some of the other big cities where you did have a professional class, you did have businesses, trading, all kinds of other things, people connected to the rest of the world. How are things working out there?
Well, thank you. I think it's an excellent question. After the transition, because of the crisis, we can say everything was upside down, the disconnection from global financial system. And as you know, the economy until 2021 was, more like a war economy. We still were not really a major producers. If you look at the last 20 years, we have improved our trade and exports. India was our top destination for our exports. And of course, the money that was coming into Afghanistan is part of the security and defense, that was happening in Afghanistan. But also, the development money that was coming was actually helping the economy to survive. Now, after 2021, at least for a good 1 or 2 years, I would say, there were tremendous amount of pressure, both on the economy, but also on the income levels of people, with thousands and thousands losing jobs. Lots of brain drain, if may I say, happened as well in the last 4 years, all because of the unavailability of economic incentives anymore. And I think this crisis sort of more became as a result of not only just the transition, but also the political position that many countries took after 2021. And that contributed, of course, to the situation that we see today. Now, according to a new report by the World Bank, the economy is back on track, which means there is some stability, but with a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how the future looks like, particularly also now with what's happening in our neighborhood with Iran and Israel conflict. I think we still have to wait how the trajectory is going to be. But how people survive, so at least $3 billion, continued to came in, mostly from the US, in terms of aid in the last 4 years, by the way. The current government have taken steps in terms of local infrastructure development. So that is creating at least some number of jobs. At the same time, some mining contracts were issued, and we also generate revenue from our imports, which is also somewhat contributing. I wouldn't say strongly contributing, but somewhat contributing to the economic activity that we have in Afghanistan. On the other side, small and medium enterprises continue to operate. All big businesses that were established in Afghanistan continue to operate, including airlines, telecom, banks, and many others. In fact, recently the Banking Association told me that they are bouncing back. The banks are experiencing finally some sort of stability, or we are over the liquidity crisis that we have just 2 years ago, and the exchange rate that you see in the market are quite stable, still giving hints or signals for local investments and local economic activity. But I agree that the big investments that maybe we were expecting to come from China and others has not happened yet. That's very true. But I think the reason is not just political, but also have to understand that Afghanistan's business environment or business climate also requires a lot of work in terms of infrastructure, services delivery, system integration, technological upgrades, and of course a workforce to serve the investments and the investors, whether locally or from abroad. And I think that has to be taken into consideration. But having said that, if you look at the investments in the last 4 years, I think Turkey, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to some extent, maybe also Pakistan, UAE, and Qatar. If you add up those private investments that are happening in Afghanistan, it reaches to almost $5 billion. So that is something very interesting I wanted to talk about. At the same time, the World Bank has restarted its operations in Kabul after 3.5 years of pause, which is a big signal also for regional investors now in Afghanistan. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, the level of economic growth is, of course, far from what ideally we should have in Afghanistan, but our traditional sectors are continued operating, and there are some level of jobs, but income levels have significantly dropped. And for many, many companies or investors outside Afghanistan, it's not just legal and political issues around the country, but also more like reputational risks that are considered when they, consider or plan to. The appetite to invest in Afghanistan has not gone down, whether for Afghan investors or for other investors. The problem is, what kind of environment do you have in Afghanistan, and how sophisticated, how effective and efficient that system is to serve the needs of investors investors and various businesses who probably do not, really care about, political or legal issues, but just because they also require effective and efficient services to continue ahead with their businesses. But also, finally, I think on this question, NGOs and other businesses continue to operate in the country. There has been a significant drop or fall in the funding that Afghanistan gets these days. But it has, maintains, I would say, the number of jobs that it used to have. So they are still there. There is, you can say, some level of consumptions continue to be there since 2021. It doesn't look great on the surface right now, but I think there has to be practical steps taken. And I think in this regard, stability and peace in Afghanistan is a prerequisite for anything, for Afghans, for foreigners, for everybody. Stability is probably the number one thing that every investor, every business wants to see in Afghanistan.
This is on the connectivity questions. The bulk of Afghanistan's foreign trade was coming through Pakistan, and then they started putting a lot of obstacles. And then we read that a lot of the trade had got diverted through Iran. But now, if you have disruptions happening in Iran, does this mean that you look for an exit route out now through Central Asia? Or does this mean that you fall back upon the Pakistani routes for your foreign trade? So in terms of connectivity, do you think that the environment around Afghanistan, both from a political angle as well as a strategic angle, is actually becoming more constrained than what it was?
We have to just wait a little bit more how this conflict in our neighborhood turns into and how does it evolve. But I think we really have to remember that, for, most of our lives, if may I say, we have seen the South Asian partners, India and Pakistan, to be our biggest trade partners. And historically speaking, we always have exported to South Asia more than anywhere else. So I think this will continue because we, are traditionally just agriculture sort of export economy, and all agriculture produce is really much in demand in South Asia, including India. In fact, our major exports go to India. So I think we will continue, to rely on the routes through Pakistan to India, that's for sure. But when it comes to our trade relation with Iran, we also have to remember that we are importing a lot from Iran and not exporting a lot. So we'll have to see how that dynamic changes. With Central Asia, I think the relationship has been great for Afghanistan right now. Uzbekistan, among the Central Asian republics, is leading this process, also working with the UN and other stakeholders in the region, how to better integrate Afghanistan into the regional connectivity agenda. In fact, the recent Termiz dialogue was all about this topic, which happened in Termiz, Uzbekistan. So yes, there are, of course, incentives for Afghan businesses and trade to go to north and, through Central Asia, access other markets. But I think that's a very small proportion of our export basket. I think we will continue to have more trade with our South Asian partners, including India and Pakistan. And we have to rely on the conventional routes, of course, to do business. Now, the recent conflict between India and Pakistan, of course, has affected a lot of things. But I think I'm very happy now that there is at least, some normalcy back. Afghanistan continues to aspire, and continues to wish to increase the trade with Afghanistan in South Asia, particularly to India, because we see India as a great market for our products and we would like to grow that. But having the Charbahar route now not in the equation, I think we have to really strategically think how we can sort of facilitate this trade between India and Afghanistan.
I don't have too much time, but I think we will have time for one question to you and perhaps one to Shivam before we open it to the flow for about 10-15 minutes. We haven't spoken about the P word today, right? So I think it's important to bring that back in, the Pakistan word, right? Uh, we've seen that relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan have been fairly strained. They've tried to paper it over, and we've seen recent efforts in trying to paper it over. Do you see those efforts actually taking off? But related to that is the question of both ISKP and TTP. Uh, now, the TTP is seen to be joined at the hip as far as the Taliban is concerned. But the Taliban seems to be saying that, look, we have no truck with these guys, and you know, we are not behind them. You handle them the way you want to do. We'll give you some comfort on that. Uh, how do you assess them doing something like that? Do you think they will be able to manage it, or do you think that will create some pressures on them? Second is the ISKP question. Again, there are a number of theories about what ISKP is all about. Yes, we know that it emerged out of the TTP or elements of the TTP, but there are also reports of how the ISKP has been growing inside Pakistan and then using bases inside Pakistan to attack the enemies of Pakistan, not so much Pakistan, but the enemies of Pakistan, which is groups like the TTP, BLA, others. And the Taliban also have a beef with the ISK. So it seems like a witch's brew all over again. What's your reading of how things are playing out? I've asked you to be brief, but I know it's
a loaded question. So I'll just throw a couple of points. I mean, one, the trajectory of relations between Rawalpindi and Kabul, is not new. In the 90s, when the Taliban were first in power, they didn't necessarily have a black and white relationship. The strains were less explicit, they were less publicly articulated, but the relations did remain strained on many points. It is not a classic patron-client relationship. There have been issues on which the Taliban previously cooperated with the Pakistanis, and there were other core issues on which they did not. So, for example, in the question of the Durand Line, the Taliban did not cooperate. Right, neither in the previous avatar nor in their current avatar. In the 90s, we saw groups like Sufi Muhammad's group acquiring reverse strategic depth in Pakistan, and we are seeing that play out with the relation to the TTP. The TTP attacks have shown a secular increase, and the Pakistanis claim that they are very, very concerned with this secular increase in attacks with the TTP. It's going to be very difficult for, I think, in my understanding, it's going to be difficult for Pakistan to explicitly and crack the whip very hard on the TTP, and this is for a number of reasons. One, they're cut from the same cloth in many ways. The TTP gave the Taliban sanctuary when they were fighting NATO. They share the same recruitment pool. A crackdown is something that the Taliban will find it very hard to sell to its own rank and file. In fact, what the Taliban has offered is that we'll relocate the TTP away from sensitive border zones. It's very different from how they are dealing with the ISKP. Also, a crackdown on the TTP will not only, it's a leverage that the Taliban has in negotiations with Pakistan, but a crackdown is something they not only will not be able to sell to their own constituency, but it's going to also galvanize ideological attacks that the ISKP has been making on the Taliban, which has accused the Taliban of cutting deals with foreigners. So the ISKP has been trying to undercut the Taliban politically on their own turf. So it's going to be very hard for the Taliban essentially to justify a crackdown on groups like the TTP. So I don't see them, cracking the whip, as it were, on groups like the TTP. Now, this is very if you look at their approach to the ISKP, it's very different. They have cracked down on the ISKP because they do sense now what the ISKP is. The waters are very muddied, as you rightly said. There are also reports that at a certain point in time, the ISKP also cooperated with the Haqqani network at the local level. There are some also say there are new that's disgruntled commanders waving a new flag. Another theory is that the ISKP is Pakistan's team B. It's in line with Pakistan's trajectory of propping up one group when the group in power doesn't toe their line. But again, this is all conjecture. We don't have conclusive evidence for this as of now. But the ISKP as of now,
Circumstantial.
yes, but not compelling evidence in the public domain.
Yeah.
But the ISKP essentially, at least in terms of its posturing, has tried to, undercut the Taliban. What we've also seen is that the ISKP has invited a crackdown from the Taliban. So a lot of the Salafis, particularly in the eastern part of Afghanistan, saw a very heavy crackdown by the Taliban on the ISKP. The ISKPs tried to shatter the narrative of the Taliban that they provide security, right? And we've seen that play out on a number of occasions. So while the overall trend of ISKP attacks in Afghanistan has shown a decrease, the Taliban have not been able to completely purge the Daesh, right? And that is because they have staged a lesser number but spectacular attacks. So they've killed foreign tourists in Bamiyan. They've attacked Taliban ideologues from time to time. The latest, of course, being Khalilur Rahman Haqqani. Again, there are different theories as to who bumped him off, but the blame, at least publicly, was pinned on the Daesh. What you've also seen is that there is today a situation where, unlike the 90s, you don't have any opposition to the Taliban. All the Mujahideen Tanzeems that had led the opposition, they've all fled the country. They have a crisis of legitimacy of their own. The geopolitical situation is very different. The ISKP is one group which has tried to challenge the Taliban, although it's not in a position to bring down the regime, but ideologically it poses a challenge. And the ISKP, from what reports are coming in, has tried to tap into all the social ferment which is there in Afghanistan, which is that, the Taliban is a regime which is ideologically exclusionary in character. It's a regime that is also perceived as a regime which is deeply ethno-nationalist in character.
But it's not as if the ISKP is not.
So
it's just as exclusionary.
Yes. Which is why, a question I often ask is that when we talk about political inclusivity in Afghanistan, it's a phrase that's thrown around very often. But what kind of political inclusivity are we talking about? Is it just ethnic representation of the kind that we had post-born? Or do you really want to think of something deeper? I think that's a question that's not been thought through. But the point I'm making is that the ISKP has been trying to tap into the social ferment that this exclusion is breeding. They've also tried to infiltrate the Taliban security apparatus. So the ISKP is trying essentially to make strides and also attack the Taliban's foreign allies. They've staged attacks on the Chinese in Kabul. They tried to stage an attack on the Russian embassy in Kabul 2 years ago. So, the ISKP is trying to position itself as the principal contender, and they're trying to tap into the ferment that is brewing. And while economically, Afghanistan hasn't done as badly as one would have expected, especially because, the economy was recovering from the shock of COVID. And then in 21, you had an abrupt withdrawal, which led to a contraction of the economy by about 25%. The economy hasn't done badly. But the problem is that, today you have a situation where, people are sort of on the brink. They're surviving, they're not starving. But if this situation sort of tips for the worse, then it will give an edge to groups like the Daesh, for instance. And it's always very difficult to predict with certainty which way the political ground will shift. Economically, you do have a situation where the US has cut off aid. And the US is the biggest provider of aid to Afghanistan. A lot of the foreign aid, despite the levels coming down, have kept essential services going, services like health and education. And that is going to impact millions of people. So it is going to lead to a lot of socio-economic ferment, and if that is not handled tacitly, that could eventually have consequences.
The last question to you before I throw it open to the floor. On the narcotics question, we've heard that the Taliban have cracked down on the narcotics question, but the flow of narcotics continues. And that's a big problem. We've seen India becoming a transit ground. In fact, India also becoming a kind of a market, considering, and the quantums are like unimaginable. Like they're running in tons and tons, thousands of tons in some cases. What are you getting on what is happening on the narcotics front? Are those mafia organizations inside Afghanistan well entrenched, part and parcel of the Taliban networks? Or is there some kind of a tussle, some kind of an effort being made to rein them in? Or is it a don't look, don't ask kind of situation out there? What's happening? Briefly, so that I can then
Yes, sir.
ask some
So
questions.
definitely on the narcotics question, there has been some sort of tussle, as you mentioned. So in terms of since the Taliban came into power initially, obviously they did ban the production of opium, but a lot of the production that the farmers had like kept in their storage, which they sell like in the next year, that was still like they could still. Sell them and do the trade and everything, and the Taliban has in some aspects been like strict in terms of like enforcing that the production does not happen. There have been reports about how they've cracked down on farmers. Kind of there have been frequent reports over the years of there being tussle between like the Taliban members as well as the local farmers, where because the rural economy to an extent does depend to a lot of extent does depend on opium production. But I would say that they have not turned a blind eye. So like the main source of opium production, which has always like in Afghanistan, which earlier it was used to happen, like I think I may be like I'm not very sure of the figure, but I think it was close to like a majority of the production used to happen in helm and all of that. That has shifted. So obviously there the production has reduced, but there are other regions like I think, but there has been recent reports about Taliban facing protests in Badakhshan, like intensive protests in Badakhshan, where the farmers did not agree to the Taliban enforcing their ban. So I think there has been some sort of a you could say like a shift in the country in terms of it has come to a decline in the traditional place where it was very much intrinsic.
Let's move to new places.
It has moved to new places, and considering like the province is also like a volatile province in terms of the Taliban facing some sort of other threats in the region. So I do not see that I don't see that the Taliban will inherently just turn a blind eye to that. They are trying to like crack down on it, but I also, as per my understanding, I have not seen like an intense crackdown in terms of the protests have been like very much similar to how they were earlier. But yeah, this time the reports did indicate that the pushback from the farmers was a bit strong. And I think the fact that it could grow, like the fact that it could actually move from like Helmand to other regions, that shows that maybe on the face of it, while for the Taliban it was they could crack down on it here, they did not care much about actually enforcing properly enforcing those bans in the other regions, because it does benefit them as well, the trade and the benefits, that the revenue that they get from the trade like illegally. So I think that aspect is still there. So they say that they have cracked down on it. I think even in their meetings with other countries, they do emphasize that they've been successful in cracking down on opium production, and they also then use that to make a case for the international community to engage with them more. I remember, I think last year at the Doha conference in July, I remember them saying that, we've cracked down at the narcotics production inside the country, but now it is the international community's responsibility to then give the Afghan people more avenues where they can earn earn revenue. So I think that is there, but I don't see like it has completely stopping down. So it's definitely.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the situation which was there 20 years back, 30 years back, 40 years back. That's always been the plea that, okay, even if we crack down on this, what is the other alternatives for the farmers, for other people? You need to give employment, you need to give them livelihoods. Where is that going to come from? So the international community is quick to prescribe what needs to be done, but not ready to put their money where their mouth is. So yeah, that's been an old problem. But we just have about 5 minutes. Okay, I'll make it 10. Any questions to any of the three panelists? Unfortunately, Elizabeth had to leave. So please raise your hands, identify yourself, keep it short and sweet, and please let us know who you're directing the question to. Please, go ahead, sir. Please identify yourself and...
I'm Dinesh Sharma. I'm a freelance journalist.
Can you speak in the mic, sir? You might not be able to hear.
Dinesh Sharma, I'm a freelance journalist. My question is, what is the impact of expulsions of Afghans from Pakistan? This how the Taliban government has taken it. These millions of Afghans, they have been expelled by Pakistan, refugees who were staying for almost 30 years. So I would like to know the reaction there.
Yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Shlok. I'm an intern here at ORF. I'm working in maritime studies in the Indo-Pacific. So
You're working maritime studies. You want to talk about a landlocked country? Okay, fine.
To be fair, it was one of my first.
Just kidding. Just kidding. You. Go ahead.
So seeing is how. So I have two questions.
Who are you asking the questions?
Ask one, huh?
I-
I'd like to address this to Mr. Suleiman as he is right now in Afghanistan. So seeing as how they've taken a very transactional approach, what are some areas of compromise that the Taliban is willing to make for de jure recognition, probably internationally? Secondly, this is a more domestic question, but in 2021, we saw the replacement of the Ministry of Women's Affairs with the propagation of virtue and prevention of vice. But since you have mentioned that there have been developments in terms of how much leeway or how many more rights are being given to women, is that something that seems like a permanent change or still temporary?
Yeah.
Yeah, myself Avinya Ghoshal, and I have a question to Raghav Sharma sir. So we spoke of a dichotomy or a dichotomous approach. So my question is, what are the indicators that show whether these external pragmatism might eventually influence the internal reform or vice versa? Because you see, Afghanistan is going with a two-way model of addressing the issue. So what are your views on this? This is what I wanted to know, sir. Thank you so much.
My name is Aditya Fogart. I'm a student pursuing political science at Davidson College, North Carolina. I had a question for Dr. Sharma. Sir, on the issue of tribal equations in Afghanistan, how does the existence of A, ethnic groups, B, clans, and C, subsidiary units in organizations such as the Taliban affect governance in the country? Well, since it's known that such entities have had long historic rivalries with one another, and it's not just them, it's also their subgroups. My question was, so how, if the Taliban is able, how is the Taliban actually able to contain these arguments, these rivalries within the organization itself? That's my question, sir.
Hi, I'm Bhaumik Mathur from South Asian University. My question is directed to Shivim. So since you talked about India-Taliban relations, so recently, like a year back or something, there were reports of American weapons which were abandoned in Afghanistan turning up in Kashmir in the hands of terrorists. So I was wondering if there was any development on that front. Like, has the Indian government raised these issues? And has the Taliban done anything? And does the Taliban have the capacity to address these counter-terror related issues, concerns which India has?
Didn't get to do it the first time. But so we've seen the Taliban regime existing for a while. From 1996, we have seen a more liberal order in terms of their interpretation of Sharia law and Islamic law. So with that and with increased international dialogue with the Taliban, are we looking at it being a more, a potentially sustainable government? What is the domestic idea of that, and also internationally?
Any other question? Anyone? Fine. Great. Suleiman, you want to go first? 3 or 4 questions put to you.
Sure, and I think important questions from Mr. Sharma on refugees. Absolutely, the returnees of people, Afghans living in Pakistan or elsewhere in higher numbers, definitely have an impact on the socio-economic fabric of Afghanistan. Integration of them back into the society is, of course, a real challenge. But if you talk to various organizations, including the International Organization for Migration, the process of integrating refugees from Pakistan was probably the most successful process led by the current government in Afghanistan. And there are various reports on this. But I understand, integrating refugees, returnees into the current context of Afghan economy, or let's say the social fabric that we have, is not an easy task. And I think that's something that we really need the support and help of organizations in other countries. And I think it's one of the successful sort of processes that we have seen unfolded in Afghanistan. I would also add that on counter narcotics, which Shivam really well explained earlier, there are certain parts in Afghanistan where you cannot grow anything but opium. So how do you deal with that? And I think that raises the questions of alternative livelihoods. And Afghanistan really requires to be a normal state working with other regional countries and in other markets to make sure that the communities have sufficient level of incomes. On the second questions, what are the areas of compromise for Taliban? I think that's a question that we should pose to the government in Kabul, and I think they would be in a better position to tell us what areas of compromise they may have. But I think from the beginning they have been very, sort of strict in how they have positioned themselves, and I feel like this is giving them a win, particularly when they were on the table with European partners. Now you can see in Afghanistan there are more than 17 missions with embassies operating in the country. There were a dozen high-level foreign delegations who have visited the country. Spain, Italy are considering to open, including UK, South Korea, Australia. We also saw the call between the foreign minister of India and the current interim minister of Afghanistan. That sort of shows that the engagement is already happening. Please, let's not just say, okay, well, this engagement will happen. I think the engagement is already happening, and it is happening maybe sometimes in a surprising way, but you can call it economic pragmatism, you can call it concerns on security and border and whatnot, but I think the engagement is quietly happening, and sometimes, of course, also in the public domain. I think on the women affairs side, look, some rules or some of the measures may seem very severe when it comes to the content of those measures. But you can see that living life in Afghanistan, just like any country in the world, and maybe particularly in the South Asian region, on a daily basis require negotiations. How do you live? How do you navigate through the complexity? Pakistan is an example. India is a great example. There are cases and examples of local power exploitations happening everywhere. I'm sure Afghanistan also have these kind of cases. But what is really important is that there is a need for bridging the gap between reality and what is portrayed on the media. I think there is a big difference how we live life in Afghanistan and how we are portrayed, or how life is portrayed on the international media. So my final thought to this would be that it's not about recognition. It's not about legitimizing, normalizing, a government. I think it's not about not abandoning Afghanistan. Countries have to think whether they are ready to abandon the 40 million population that lives in the country. I think that's a question that needs to be put on the table. But of course, there are avenues to engage on business, education, women's survival, connectivity, trade. There's so many entry points for engagement. And engagement, by the way, is not appeasement. And I want to say this from the depth of my heart. In the time of sort of isolationist reflexes, I think it is an act of moral realism. We have to really consider this is 2025. This is a very different world than we used to have even a decade ago. So we really have to make sure. And I think lastly, we also have to consider the sort of a double standard, or double standards exercised by the world and by the international system. The confidence on the international system has significantly declined. We have seen multiple cases, recently also with Israel just annihilating Gaza and killing more than 50,000 people, but the country still enjoys diplomatic and strategic support from all around. Myanmar is another example. We saw that what happened in Myanmar continues to receive support from ASEAN and others. So I think this is the selective isolation strategy is not a policy. And detouring Afghanistan and ignoring Afghanistan is not a policy. I think it's a missed opportunity right now.
To answer your question on will external engagement influence internal reform, what we have to understand is that even the Taliban today are far more exposed to the outside world. They do realize that Afghan society that they're dealing with today is very different from the one they had ruled over, in the 90s. It is a society which has aspirations. It's a society that is far more plugged into the rest of the world. I think the question for them is how do they navigate the business essentially of bringing those aspirations in sync with the ideological rhetoric of the movement, which has been very, very, let's say at odds with aspirations, particularly of young urban Afghans, right? That is a challenge. So it has tempered to a certain degree the ideological dogmatism of certain sections of the Taliban movement. But it's hard to say if it will influence it, because there are a lot of other dynamics at play. A lot of the Taliban leaders essentially have their families outside, including sympathizers of the Taliban. I met somebody last year who had come to Delhi. He was, he's fairly, let's say, clued into the system. He's patronized by the Haqqanis, and he waited for 3 years, eventually sent his daughter to Turkey for studies because he said she was just wasting time. And he said it's unlikely that they're going to change. So I don't think external engagement has tempered certainly some ideological dogmatism, but that by itself is, I don't think, going to lead to change per se. That will have to come from within, and that's a tussle we've seen play out in the Taliban, over the last couple of months in particular. That tussle has sharpened. So I think that process of negotiation is going to come from within, if it comes at all. So it's tempered, it's influenced, but I don't think the outside world is in a position really to sit and preach to the Taliban at this stage. This is what we want you to do. They do realize that that's also one sticking point as far as de jure recognition is concerned. That's held back recognition because that is a moral blot, so to speak. But I don't see that changing anytime soon. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. To your question on ethnic groups and tribes and its influence on governance, Afghanistan is a very, very complex society. You actually don't have any English equivalent also of the word ethnicity, in the Dari language. So ethnicity is a very fluid phenomenon in Afghanistan. And it's a society that's run on networks, and the Taliban in this sense actually are not very different from any of their predecessors. You look at, whether you look, for instance, at, the adversaries of the Taliban, you look at Rabbani, you look at Ahmad Shah Massoud. Massoud didn't patronize all Tajiks, or Rabbani also, didn't fill his office with only Tajiks. He actually filled his office mostly with people from Badakhshan, particularly people from Yaftal, the district he came from. Similarly, Ahmad Shah Massoud essentially patronized a lot of Panshiris, though he built to be fair to him, he built the movement on pan-Islamic credentials. But in terms of governance, the practice essentially on relying on social networks. And these social networks are usually very local. This is not something peculiar to the Taliban. It's been characteristic of various regimes that have ruled Afghanistan. The difference and the challenge really for the Taliban is that the Taliban, and this has actually been a challenge for a lot of movements that adhere to political Islam. Political Islam does not explicitly acknowledge societal cleavages because it regards them to be a sign of jahaliyat, right? But the fact is that very often these societal cleavages have tended to get the better of these movements. So I think the challenge for the Taliban is to bridge the gap, the rhetoric between the rhetoric of equality and using religion as a plank to unite all Afghans, and say that we serve all Afghans irrespective of ethnic and tribal differences, and the reality which is very different, which is exclusionary. It's breeded some degree of ferment even within Taliban ranks, and we've seen that play out on a number of occasions, and we've also seen the Taliban's response to it. And that response has been also the use of coercion to essentially marginalize or incarcerate commanders from groups, who voiced displeasure, to bumping off their Hazara commander. But the bumping off of the Hazara commander was a mix of societal discontent coupled with, feuding over sharing spoils of coal that was being mined. But they've not hesitated from liquidating people who've crossed those red lines. So they've used coercion essentially also to contain rivalries within the ranks of the movement. And we've seen this play out at the highest levels. We've seen the Haqqanis being very critical essentially of the Taliban. Right? They've talked about monopolization of power. But again, remember, this is not something entirely new. In the 90s, when the Taliban were advancing, the Jalaluddin Haqqani and the Taliban didn't really have a very pleasant relationship from the very outset. There was always some degree of friction. And Jalaluddin, while he was an influential military commander, he didn't get a plum portfolio like defense. He got a very peripheral ministry like tribes and border affairs, which again feeds into the fact that, the Haqqanis essentially come from the Zadran tribe who've traditionally not been part of the power apparatus, right? So there are frictions, and this is not something unique to the Taliban. Like any other political group, they are socially embedded, right? And that embeddedness then means that they also operate on some of these networks. So yeah, I'll stop here. I know we're short of time.
On your question about American weapons being found in Kashmir, so yeah, I think the first reports about this emerged back in Feb 2022, and this has been a significant concern for India. A lot of, I think last year there were a few terror attacks in while the gun battles between the army and the militants. In those battles as well, a lot of rifles and night vision goggles and communication devices were intercepted. Even some of the Jaish militants, Jaish terrorists transgressing into India, they have also been seen with these weapons. So this is a significant concern for India. And this feeds into India's, one of the reasons why India has been engaging with Afghanistan. So obviously, whatever engagements India and Taliban have had in the past 4 years, India has made sure that, the Taliban acknowledge India's security concerns. And on a number of instances, the Taliban have done so. The Taliban have stated that they would not let Afghanistan be used against India. But there are still reports, different reports. But yeah, there have been reports about the presence of Jaish and Lashkar terrorists inside Afghanistan. So that is a cause of concern for India. The Taliban also, recently, I think one of their spokesperson released a public statement saying that, they don't have any militants inside the country, and it's all just done to kind of malign the image of Afghanistan. So that kind of, the fact that publicly they still maintain that stance, that does bring into question the Taliban's willingness and capability to actually address India's security concerns. So that is still there. Obviously, India would want its security threats to be, and India would want the Taliban to act on whatever is threatening India's interest in the region. But yeah, the Taliban's ability to do that is still circumspect. It has, especially after Operation Sindoor, there were some other, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. They are also supposedly they're present within Afghanistan. So they also released a statement against India calling out for jihad. So those risks are there, and the Taliban not taking a very strong stance against them, so that does that is a cause of concern for India. So it is to be seen how they actually come about and assist India in this situation.
Can I add just one line? So it's also very interesting, in this context of Operation Sindoor, to actually look at the readouts of Jaishankar's call with his counterpart in Kabul. So while the MEA essentially said that, they condemned terrorism and essentially condemned the attack in Pahalgam, the foreign ministry of the Taliban actually made no mention of it. They said we talked about trade, we talked about visas, we talked about enhancing connectivity. There was absolutely silence, pin drop silence on the question of. So again, there's not necessarily a sinking of diplomatic priorities over here.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you, Suleiman. Excellent interventions you made. Thanks, Shivam, for putting this whole thing together. Many thanks, Professor Sharma, as usual, always coming up with great insights. Thanks to Aditya, my colleague, for being part of this entire process and organizing it. And of course, the ORF team that put together this whole thing. Thank you, everyone, for attending this on a rainy day. I hope you people reach on time. Thanks.